Well, there are calls from some quarters within the government for a Religious Discrimination Act to provide greater protections to people of faith. Now, the issue was raised by Social Services Minister Dan Tehan during the St Thomas More lecture in Canberra. He says greater protections are needed following the passage of euthanasia legislation in Victoria and the introduction of laws compelling priests to break the seal of the confessional and report child sex abuse. James Paterson is a Liberal Senator for Victoria. He's backing these calls. He's on the line right now. Thanks for your time.
Pleasure to be with you.
Well, I've got to say, when we talk about this issue, and we have talked about it in a different context a lot over the last couple of years, it was to do with the same-sex marriage legislation and concerns, and I think very valid concerns as well, that religious rights would be undermined. In your mind, has that happened?
There isn't any real concrete examples in Australia yet of the high-profile cases that we've seen, say, in the United States or the UK or Ireland, where there have been quite celebrated court cases. We haven't had yet that in Australia, and I think that's a really good thing, and I hope that remains the case.
Yep.
But I don't think we can just rely on hope alone. I think we need to be absolutely sure that there are not going to be any cases like that, and there's something the Parliament can do about that, and that's to pass laws to make sure that religious liberty is more robustly protected in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, you really would like to see this handled by legislation before there is a test case, so to speak.
Exactly. By then it'll be too late. By then it will have come at someone's expense. Someone will be the victim of a case like that. And so I think it's quite complacent to say that because we haven't seen any yet, that means there never will be any.
Okay. Well, as I said in the introduction there, as you've said, as Dan Tehan has said, there's more than just now, though, the same-sex marriage legislation. There's other instances which really raise the question about whether we should have this separate discrimination act.
That's exactly right. There's a whole range of areas in which people of faith in particular, I think, are being pushed out of the public square. Their views are being stifled, and that's not something we want to see in a pluralistic society like Australia's. I'm actually personally agnostic. I'm not religious, but I realise the value of living in a free society that preserves everyone's right to religious freedom.
Yeah, well, I think it's important as well. I mean, do you think we've got to the point where some people of religious faiths are feeling afraid to speak up and share their religious views for being shouted at in the public debate?
I think there's no question that's the case, and it is a big theme of the submissions made to the Ruddock inquiry being conducted by former Attorney General Philip Ruddock. Individual after individual and organisation after organisation say that they feel that because of their faith, that their perspective is not as welcome in public debate, and that adverse action might be taken against them if they honestly speak up about their sincerely held religious beliefs.
I mean, we live in a secular society, at least from the way government works. So I guess when we talk about this, we're often talking about whether Christians feel free to speak up. But if you're doing having a Religious Discrimination Act, we'd have to accept that would include all religions, wouldn't it?
You're right. Religious liberty is a freedom for everyone. It's not just for Christianity, and it's not just for any particular brand of Christianity. It's for people of all faiths, because everyone has an equal right to live their life according to their values and to live a life of integrity consistent with their faith. And it's not sufficient to just say you can believe what you believe in your own mind if you can't also act out in your life, in the world, your beliefs, and share your beliefs with others.
Providing, of course, that isn't breaking another law. That's, I guess, where the catch-22 could come into effect.
That's right. I mean, religious liberty is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It doesn't allow you to coerce your fellow citizens into sharing your beliefs or participating in your religious practices if they don't wish to, if they don't choose to. So the calls that you see from time to time to allow Sharia law, for example.
That was the example I was going to raise, yes.
Yeah, where women are subjugated, where children sometimes particularly...
Where you can have multiple wives for that.
That's right. Yep. All of those things are inconsistent with basic Australian values and inconsistent with the principle of liberty for everyone and pluralism for everyone. I mean, religious liberty is just as much a right to not be religious, to change your religion, to leave your faith if you choose.
So we'd still have one law for all, which I think is very important, and that always is raised as an example when we raise the prospect of Sharia law. One law for all, but still another law that protects the freedom of religious expression.
Exactly, and I think expression is a very important way of putting it, because unfortunately in Australia today it's actually legally unclear whether it's safe to share your religious beliefs in public. The Archbishop Julian Porteous, the Catholic Archbishop of Tasmania, found that out the hard way by sharing a pamphlet prior to the same-sex marriage survey about the Catholic Church's teachings on marriage, and he was taken to the Anti-Discrimination Commission in Tasmania under Section 17 of their Anti-Discrimination Act. And thankfully that complaint was subsequently withdrawn, but because of that we don't actually know whether it is legally safe to share your view on marriage in Tasmania today.
Yeah, that's not good. As you say, need clarity. Now, what makes it more complicated is that we have numerous strands here. And as we've already talked about, we've got several states in the process of introducing laws to compel priests to report information relating to child sex abuse, which they hear in the confessional. How do you think that should be handled, particularly in the light of a Religious Discrimination Act?
You're right, this is a very complex area of law because it's got intersecting state legislation, federal legislation, but also international treaties which we've signed up to, which require us to uphold religious liberty. I'm obviously not a Catholic, and so I haven't gone to confessional, and it's not part of my faith tradition. But I do understand how central and how important it is to Catholics, and I do understand that Catholic priests have taken a vow to uphold the sanctity of the confessional, and any attempt by the state to force them to break that vow is a fairly fundamental restriction on their religious liberty. So I think we need to tread with extreme caution here. I think if any priest was ever compelled to break the seal of confession, it's much more likely they would voluntarily go to jail, just in the way that from time to time journalists say that they would never breach
their contacts,
confidentiality of their sources, and they would be willing to go to jail for it. I don't think we want to see a situation in Australia where we're locking up priests or journalists simply for respecting the confidence of people who are given them to them.
Well, I guess the retrospectivity of it's the problem with this as well. If you were to say anybody who takes a confessional from here on in could be subject to having to reveal what was said, that's very different to saying to somebody 15 years ago in a different context, you have to tell us what was said.
Well, that's a really good point, and actually Dan Tehan touched on that in his speech to the St Thomas More dinner, where he noted that many of these priests took their vows years ago, swore on the Bible in a very faithful and sincere way to uphold those things, with no knowledge that in the future they might be compelled to break that. So we shouldn't be compelling people to break their sincerely held vows.
How easy do you think it will be to get some momentum up to make this actually happen?
I think there's widespread agreement that there are gaps in the Australian law and that it can and should be addressed. I think that a lot of people recognise that it's not sufficient to just leave the law as it is. There are gaps, particularly, say, in New South Wales and South Australia in their discrimination law. But even the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, not exactly renowned for being a friend of my side of politics, has pointed out that Australia's protection of religious liberty is not adequate by international standards and doesn't stand up to the international agreements we've signed.
Senator James Paterson, thanks for your time.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.